We talked about the inflection points of Stevens and then your wife joining in there. You said there have been a few others. Tell our listeners about some of the other major inflection points in your life.
When I was writing my PhD dissertation, and my advisor was a French game theorist, and he came from a deeply mathematical tradition, but it's a mathematical tradition which converts mathematics into art. And when I say art, I genuinely mean art. I don't mean art in the sense of, here's something beautiful. He literally would take something incredibly complex and very, very, challenging from a core, scientific standpoint, and you could convert that into a simple diagram. And that simple diagram could explain something very profound and deep. And of course, all of that was within a highly refined theoretical construct. But the inflection point here, and this is, I was deeply influenced by my advisor and his advisor. He wasn't, advisor as in he was like this second person I'm going to talk about is like a mentor to all of us who grew up in this tradition. His name is Leo Hurwitz, and Leo eventually won the Nobel Prize in economics. And the inflection point in studying Leo's work and then doing my own work in the area and my own small contribution into that space was recognizing that markets are enormously important. They are fundamental to the way we organize society, to the way society changes and moves, to the way development happens, to the way the reverse of development happens. They're a fundamental force of social transformation and change. But at the same time, markets don't deliver what is socially optimal, and and we could prove that in a very abstract mathematical model. In fact, I don't even need to write out this very complex set of equations to tell you that. I could draw a picture and convince you that markets are wonderful and at the same time, markets fail. And so to me, this was an inflection point as well, that in form of intellectual growth, recognizing that we need to pair markets with solutions to market failure, and being able to explain this in relatively simple terms, because this stuff is so deeply theoretical that very few people care about these issues, care about, essentially what we used to do is we used to prove theorems where, there were five people in the world who, cared about those theorems, and you met them in the same conferences and you proved your theorem. Maybe you proved, two lemmas, and that was your work for, 5 years. And people would appreciate that work, and, you would appreciate their lemmas, and that was it. You somehow didn't quite, connect with the real world. But the underlying philosophy was the lens through which I realized that there was an incredible connection to what is happening in the world around us. And I call that an inflection point is because that then shaped, some of the directions that I took in my own journey.
We always say, hey, if I hadn't done this, then the path could have gone, because that's what our listeners want to know.
As I mentioned, we were. I was basically part of this, small community of mathematical economists. We were trying to come up with mechanisms that would address this problem of market failure, all within the construct of mathematics. And I was at what used to be the old Bell Labs, where much of technological invention had happened. And then post the breakup of the Bell system, the Bell Labs had been broken up into AT&T Bell Labs and Bell Core. and so Belcore was funded by all the seven baby bells, and AT&T Bell Labs was funded by AT&T. The seven baby bells were basically monopolies, so they could continue to do blue sky research, and that's what we were doing. We were sitting and doing blue sky research in the labs. And I realized that just at that time, some profound changes were happening in the world of telecommunications and technology. As in, people were talking about this thing which looks like this today. But at that time, it used to look like a phone with an old-fashioned phone with a wire attached to it. And people were talking about the fact that phones are things that wouldn't have wires attached to it, and you could just walk around and drive around, with these things. And there was an emerging excitement about an industry that could deliver digitally deliver wireless communications to people everywhere. And as the regulators and the phone companies the phone companies funded our labs, there was intense discussions about how this wireless communications industry was going to come about. And the regulators, we kind of met with several of them, and we asked them, so how is it going to happen? They said, well, the operators are going to get radio spectrum, from the government, and they will go off and use the radio spectrum to build wireless networks on them. And then ask them, so how did you decide how much to charge for the radio spectrum, or whom to give the radio spectrum to, or the license to use the radio spectrum? And so, basically whoever we met last night, and if we had a good time, off you go. I mean, I'm literally this was probably not the exact thing that I they said, but something close. And I said, do you realize that everybody's talking about these wireless phone thing being, worth, billions of dollars, trillions, and you guys just sort of, just gave it away. This is public property. You're giving it to a private operator without, knowledge of, all those profits. Shouldn't some of it come back to society? And I said, well, that's kind of an interesting idea, but how do we price this? Because we have no idea. Nobody had any idea, of what this industry would deliver. And there was this company called McKinsey, which at that time, basically had sort of said this thing is going to go nowhere. And uh, so they said, do you have a solution? And then, several of us who were kind of, in this world of game theory kind of said, yeah, there is possibly a solution where you don't know how to price an object. You put it up for auction, and then the market kind of decides, how much it is priced. And so you set it up, set up auctions. So there was a whole discussion around a wider group of, theoretical, folks like myself and others who kind of say, okay, how do we design an auction for these wireless communication systems? And in that process, we actually ended up, creating auctions for wireless communications, both in the United States, which then spread all over the world, certainly to India and other places. And the wireless industry sort of came about. Um, that was an inflection point in the sense that I realized that there was a whole bunch of theoretical work that we were doing in our own little offices and in conferences and so on, which no one else cared about except for the five other people in your field. But if we were to cross this river into the real world and be able to have a conversation with somebody who could figure out, hey, there's a connection between this theoretical stuff you guys are doing and a genuine social need, a societal need, a whole bunch of transformational stuff can happen. And I felt suddenly that was a change, which is that I thought, I really enjoyed being away from the real world, which was a bit of a nuisance, really, and the you know the clean nature of mathematics was wonderful, but it was exciting that you could apply hardcore mathematics to real world applications. So that became a transformation moment in my life where I said, okay, I'm going to apply a whole bunch of things that I've learned in theory to actually help decision makers make better decisions and thereby translate that into better societal outcomes. So this was kind of one moment where I kind of went from the labs to at that time I didn't know how one does this, but people said there's this whole industry called consulting where apparently you can do these kinds of things. So that's what's my journey from academia to and R and high tech R&D to consulting. So that's kind of one inflection point. Let me give you a second inflection point, which is now having gone into consulting, you realize that consultants become really good at you know uh, instead of doing hardcore mathematical models, they build spreadsheets. They do lots of analyses, and they make up all kinds of assumptions. Sometimes the assumptions are based on something, and sometimes the assumptions are whatever a late night conversation has developed. So you build this house of cards, and then you come up with these brilliant PowerPoint presentations, and then you try to convince decision makers that what, we are the clever, the most clever people in the room, and you should believe that we've done all this hard work, and now you should follow the recommendation we made. So that was the attitude that I took to the continent of Africa, where one of the reasons why I stayed in consulting for as long as I did was because one of my first assignment was going to Africa and recognizing that the entire continent was completely disconnected from this other big thing that was happening at that time, this thing called the internet. And the internet was basically being carried on fiber optic cables that were connecting continents. And the two land masses that were not connected to the fiber optic system, one was Africa, the other was Greenland. So we'll put Greenland aside for now. Africa, we basically were working with, at that time, AT&T had its own navy, literally, AT&T submarine systems that would lay fiber optic cable, on the ocean floor, and then the plan was to put a fiber optic network around the continent of Africa. So I would travel to various parts of the continent, to give these talks about how connection to this thing called the internet and modern telecommunications would be transformational to Africa. One of the defining places was a talk I gave in Pretoria in South Africa. And South Africa was, of course, critical to this whole thing because it was, a big economy by African standards. It was also, I'll give you the year, 1994. 1994, 1995. And if you go back to the history books, this was the time when Nelson Mandela was just stepping into the role of being the next president of South Africa. Uh, history of apartheid has just ended. We were literally, I was walking into history. And so I kind of gave this, I thought, a brilliant talk. Every consultant would be proud of this talk. I mean, the most complex model, the most brilliant PowerPoint presentation. After the talk, the Minister of Telecom came over, patted my back, and he said, "That was brilliant, excellent, wonderful." And so I said, "Okay, so now are you guys willing to join, this network system, this cable system?" And they said no. So I asked them why. They said, well, no, because President Mandela doesn't want it. And so I said, wait a minute, why does President Mandela not want it? He said, well, President Mandela has just returned from a trip to Malaysia, and he and Prime Minister Mahathir of Malaysia have become the closest of buddies, and they're going to do everything together. So President Mandela's mission right now is to do everything with Malaysia first before we do anything else. So he doesn't want to sort of create all these relationships with the rest of Africa. He wants a fiber optic network that connects South Africa to Malaysia. And I looked at him and I said, that makes no sense at all. And just look at the map, and you draw a line from South Africa to Malaysia. You basically have a fiber optic thread hanging in the middle of the ocean. And let's do some quick spreadsheets in our head. That's cost. Basically point A to point B in the middle of the ocean. Where do revenues come from? Revenues come from that string being close to a landmass where there are people, who are delivering you, calls and internet and all that kind of internet connectivity and so on. That's not happening. So you're spending a ton of money. There's no revenues coming in. This makes no sense whatsoever. So this Minister of Telecom, he puts his arm even tighter around me, and he says, you seem like a smart person, and you probably are. But you think you're smarter than you actually are. And he said, you don't argue with President Mandela. And so I went back, with my tail between my legs, and that was the end of that discussion. The next day, I was in the ministry, walking the corridors, and some of the old bureaucrats there, they pulled me into the office. They said, "What happened? How did the talk go?" I said, "The talk was brilliant. I thought it was one of the best talks I'd given, but the outcome was horrible because they said no, and then they want this thing with Malaysia." And so these guys, they said, this country is about to collapse because of this new administration, this Nelson Mandela administration. And what we need is, and these bureaucrats were all the leftovers from the legacy apartheid administration. So, what we need is not a connection to Malaysia, not a connection to the rest of Africa, but a connection to Northern Europe. So, that's what this country needs. And I realized the reason why I give you this long story, and it's an inflection point, is we go in with this, whether we are consultants or technologists or business people, or we go in with this massive analytical, superstructure, try to convince people that this is the right approach, and here's, we've done all the hard work and the math and all that kind of stuff. But what really, really matters is, on top of all that, what changes decisions and transformational decisions are history, are personalities, and how global relations form. So Nelson Mandela at that point had realized that he wanted to completely reinvent the way he was going to build coalitions. And I had kind of gone in the eye of the storm at that point. And I simply could not understand why they didn't see the economic logic that I was putting in front of them. And Nelson Mandela and his team had a very different idea of what they wanted to do with the future of South Africa. And it took me a while to recognize that. And I kind of call that my Mandela moment. And I think it was another inflection point, which is recognizing that the left brain activity that we do, we spend so much of our time, whether it's in business or in policy or in technology, doing all this left brain stuff. It's the right brain stuff where it's history, it's culture. Those white bureaucrats in telecom, they were scared for their lives, and they wanted, let's go back to Northern Europe. And so their history was colliding with Mandela's future. And those of us who go into decision making or decision advising roles, we forget that it's the left and the right brain that needs to come together in order to kind of figure out the right path forward. So that was, again, a huge transformational moment in my life, that you need context, an awareness of context, contextual intelligence on top of these classic forms of intelligences that we train people in business schools and companies and policy schools.
What did they finally pick? Just for my to close the story, did they go Malaysia, Northern Europe, or within Africa, or none?
Yeah. So what ended up happening was the Malaysia connection, because of the economic challenges. I mean, no private submarine cable provider would provide it. So we ended up with creating smaller arcs that were built. So instead of one ring altogether, these arcs were developed part by part, and it took about close to 10 years for the whole thing to actually get completed. So it did get completed, but it took a long time. For essentially, you needed all the countries along the coast of Africa to agree to come on board. So it did get finished, and many of those arcs initially went through the Mediterranean, and they went all the way to India and then out to Southeast Asia. So much of the growth that we saw in terms of Indian IT actually benefited from the first part of the laying of that cable. So it does tie into a whole bunch of developments that were transformational, not so much to Africa but to India.
Yeah. Uh, Bhaskar, one of the things we talk about, and obviously I'm being respectful of your time, is the role of mentors. A lot of our people want to ask, you worked in some incredible places, academic as well as corporate. Have there been mentors who have helped you along the way? And what can you tell our listeners about the role of mentors, and where can they find them?
Each one of us walks a different journey. in terms of seeking mentorship. Um, we do not and cannot make progress in life without the influence of others. And that influence can come in many ways. Sometimes it is an explicit form of advisory, mentorship, and guidance, and handholding, and apprenticeship. Sometimes it is implicit, and sometimes you just inhale it. Um, the example of my father was I inhaled it. I didn't even know I was being mentored, but I was just a little boy, and I was kind of growing up. uh, when I was in fourth grade in school, I had a teacher who asked us to write an essay, and I still remember the essay was called "If I Could Fly." And she returned the essay I wrote. It was completely covered in red ink. She had literally rewritten the whole thing, and then she had put the highest grade, excellent, on the essay. And I think partly because I was one of her favorite students, so she basically just inflated my grade. But it did two things to me. One is the red ink. I took every single comment very, very seriously, and the other was this, the grade. I just felt lifted. The false sense of of being lifted. It gave me it gave me a sense of encouragement and support that that red ink, the post red ink version of the essay, is the essay that I wrote and eventually will write. Thanks to that push that I got. So this is the fourth grade teacher. And to this day, it uh, every sentence I will write, I will think about, is there somebody who's going to put red ink on it? So I really care about how words come together, how sentences sound in your own head. So those little things, matter. And as I mentioned, mentorship, goes in comes in many different ways. Sometimes it's very specific. Sometimes it is in your atmosphere, and sometimes it is, like my advisor and Leo Hurwitz. You take something which is an incredibly complex societal phenomenon, and you reduce it to art. And today, as I think about reducing it to art, in addition to a few other things I do, I'm also a sculptor. So I work on stone. And I feel so much of my life is actually taken up by trying to understand the future of artificial intelligence and how that is going to change our lives. We study digital technologies across the world, but I don't want to leave behind where we all come from, the Stone Age. And so putting aside these tools, just going right back to, I still have my hands are calloused, from working on with a hammer and a chisel and a file on a 50-pound rock. And uh, there's a guy who runs a studio who's not as much of a mentor as just gently nudging and providing some suggestions. But we are sort of working on this piece of rock, and looking at it collectively. And sometimes he says, just don't do anything. Just put your hand on the rock, and the rock is going to tell you, you know, what to do next. So sometimes the mentorship can come from an inanimate object, but with a little bit of nudging from the human being. So I think it comes from all forms. And of course, there are people like us, who are the old farts, the professors, the advisors, the consultants. We do play a mentorship role, but that's the kind of that stuff you get all the time. And I'll say one more thing, and I know my answers are long and complex to very simple questions. And I learned, a lot about, mentorship, being a parent myself, about, you know, raising kids. And I don't really have a particular philosophy about how one does it well or not. I just feel incredibly fortunate. That is one of the greatest things. You mentioned all those other things in my life. I don't think I'm proud of any of that. It's just a lot of it is just a series of some choices, some accidents, and it's you at the right place at the right time, and stuff happens. But being a parent is in many ways, there's a lot of things that you do, either deliberately or not, that you create human beings, who on the other side, could do wonderful things. And I think about that role of being a mentor that happens every day. Regardless of where I was in life and what I was doing, it was always a goal which I pretty much met 90, 5+% of the time, which is to give breakfast to my kids and read to them at breakfast. And these are two kids, who grew up at different times in their lives. And despite, a very, very challenging schedule, both for myself and my wife, did that. And so just a simple thing where you almost sort of create some rules of mentorship for yourself. So we're reading a book, and if I'm not making enough progress in finishing the book, I realize that we are not meeting often enough for breakfast. So I'll sort of change my travel schedule to make sure I'm there.
Bhaskar, at the end, we have this lightning round of questions. So we're going to ask you some interesting questions, but these are generally one word or a sentence, if you can. And we ask this of all our guests is, give us your definition of Indianness. This show is called Indianness, but what would be your definition of Indianness?
Indianness has to do with um, recognizing uh, the lack of boundaries. And whether it is boundaries in terms of personal space or boundaries in terms of our understanding of what are the problems to solve for and how they come up. They come from many different reasons, and how we think about solutions and prescriptions to making change. And I think the whole idea of Indianness, sometimes people call it jugaad or so. It's kind of like saying, okay, I'm just going to grab from wherever, whichever toolbox is readily available, and somehow I'll figure out a place to sit in a, back in the day we used to have third class in on trains, and I'll just find a little edge on a seat, and I'll sit there, and I'll be sitting on a train which takes 36 hours from New Delhi to Calcutta, and it's called Tufan Express. Tufan meaning, something that goes very fast, but this one doesn't. So it's this lack of boundaries in everything, uh, embracing it instead of kind of saying, okay, I'm this. So I think Indianness is the lack of boundaries.
Pick one, game theory or gut instinct.
Game theory.
Let's give you something a little more interesting. St. Stephen's College or Fletcher School? Pick one.
Tough one, but St. Stephen's.
Foreign policy or Harvard Business Review?
Well, I'm going to give you a longish answer to this. Foreign policy is where my heart is in terms of the core of what I write about. Harvard Business Review is where I reach the widest audience, and the audience that really makes a difference based on what I write.
McKinsey or academia?
Interestingly, I'll say McKinsey.
Bhaskar, this has been truly a remarkable conversation. Really, I've enjoyed it. From what strikes me is the through line of your journey. From the intellectual ferment of St. Stephen's to Bell Labs, to McKinsey, to all these amazing academic institutions. But you asked the same question. Your roots and how to spend your life decoding the game theory of your progress, because you're a game theorist in many ways. And I think your concept of small AI is not also just an academic idea. It's in many ways a deeply Indian idea, the belief that purpose matters more than power in some ways. So, I really love some of the things that you're working on, and we need to have you on our other podcasts. And in many ways, you're the best sense of bridge between the East and the West, between theory and practice, and between the world of business and the world itself. So thank you for sharing your story with us, with the Indianness family. And I know our listeners of Changemakers across the global Indian diaspora will carry your insights. And Bhaskar, thanks again for being on the podcast and opening up to us. And I had a lot more questions to ask, but that's episode 2. Thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Sanjay. I enjoyed this, and I think I learned a little bit about myself through this process as well. So I appreciate it.